Okay, we're going to take a look at making LODs for your models. What we've learned previously was to select our model and then go up to Mesh and Reduce. And we get this little menu here, and you can try this percentage down to 50%. We could try even lower, or sorry, even higher, and we end up with fewer and fewer polygons. Yes, but obviously this is not the most ideal result here. We took off 80%, but what we're left with is a useless model. The problems with this are that we've lost the silhouette. Let me undo this. We can see that we used to have, even further, there we go. We used to have a very round edge here, nice definition along the chunks of icing in this case, because on this donut here. And just overall a form that is being supported by its polygons. Now, when you use this reduce feature, it's just going to be collapsing the shortest edges that it can find based on this production percentage that you input right here. And it's not smart enough to know which edges are good ones to collapse and which ones are going to make a giant mess like this. So really, we can't use this feature. When we're done with doing it the proper way, you will see uh, a couple of versions that I've made here, and you can see what a much more ideal result would be. And if we compare these in terms of poly count, we can see that this first one here is actually still pretty close to the original one. It could probably stand on its own. It looks pretty good, and we could use that in game, and nobody would really be complaining terribly much. And even this last one still kind of looks pretty okay. So I'm going to show you how to do it the right way, which is going to result in this. So now that we're done with these, I'm actually just going to delete those. And first off, make sure that you rename your model to whatever it's going to be called, underscore LOD0. Exactly formatted like that. All caps LOD0. No underscores, no spaces there, just LOD0. And that is important because Unity is going to use those names to hook up the LOD component. All right, so now that we have this in here, I highly recommend that you hook up your textures uh, because LODs still have to be UV mapping to the correct places. So I'm going to go up to Maya Classic up here, change this to UV editing, okay, and set my view there. Okay, and the reason I bring up UV editing is so that I can see my UVs. We already made the UVs, as we've learned before, but we do want to make sure that as we make edits to the model, these UVs don't go crazy or get destroyed over here. Then I'm just going to hop over to the attribute editor, go into my Lambert 1 shader here. Normally you wouldn't want to edit Lambert 1, but it doesn't matter because we're not exporting it and sharing that material. We don't care for what comes into Unity, but I do want to hook up a texture to it so I can better see what's going on here. So I'm going to browse for my texture, go to File, browse for that file, and I've got this hooked up in my project for Donut Albedo. You don't need all the texture maps, just this one is going to do just fine. When we select this now, we see the textures show up over here. Now this model we can take a lot of liberties with because it's got such a large texture area here, and they're not particularly precise islands, so it's not going to be that big of a deal. But let's go ahead and start making our first level of detail. So I'm going to duplicate this piece right here, Control D, and I'm going to hide LOD0 just by pressing H on that one and go back over here. So now we have LOD1, and we need to start making decisions about what polygons can be reduced on this piece. Now, my personal preference for building LODs is that we can actually reuse the LODs not just for what we swap the model out for as we get farther away, but also when you turn down the quality slider in game, you are going to swap out the high poly count models for the first LOD. And so that first LOD really ought to still look pretty good. What I'm going to do here, though, is I'm going to go into edge mode, and hopefully if you've modeled your models correctly, you've got nice edge flow working through here, and we can actually just start deleting edge loops. So if I hit Control Delete, remember with edges, you got to hit Control Delete, otherwise you're going to leave behind vertices. So Control Delete, okay, that's one, and grab this one and control delete that one. Now this has pretty drastically changed the silhouette of this thing, and we've ended up with this kind of sharp edge here, and that's not really ideal. So I'm going to undo those, and I have a slightly better plan. If I select this edge and shift click this one, instead of an edge loop, we can get an edge ring, which is almost the same thing, but it pulls along this whole edge here. We can see the difference. It's that they are vertical instead of horizontal, and it goes along this whole perimeter here. And I'm going to collapse these, and it's kind of like deleting the edge loop, but it actually just collapses this and merges that to the center. So that's going to keep our silhouette a little bit better there. And I'm going to do the same thing here. So that one, shift double click there, and collapse. Okay, and you can get to that context menu by holding shift and right click, and that will bring up the context menu, the marking menu, I should say. Okay, and then similarly, we're going to come along here on this donut and collapse that edge. Okay, and we have relatively little change going on there because of that, but we've reduced the poly count quite a bit, which is exactly the goal. Okay, and grab that one, same thing, collapse. That one, same thing, collapse. And as we get to the center here, we actually can take quite a few more liberties because you're not going to see that as much if you're this far away, right? And then on here, I've got an extra detail loop that runs the length of my whole model. This one right here. It's essentially 1, 2, 3 edge loops that run along there, and that looks really good on the high quality model, but it's eating up a lot of polygons, so I'm going to get rid of that one. Control delete. Boom. And we have very little difference there. And that's kind of the difference between the highest poly model and the first LODs. At the highest poly model, we just go crazy with poly count. We get all the polygons we need in there. We bevel edges. We make them look absolutely stunningly beautiful. But when we get to this stage, we rip a lot of those details back out. And same thing I'm going to do right here because I had the same thing going on there. Control delete. Bam. And it almost looks no different at this stage. So that's exactly what we want. Okay, and we might have gone a little bit crazy on this one with this kind of sheared off edge there, but you know, you'll have to play with it and see what works for your model. So if I unhide my LOD 0, we can and move this one over, we can see the difference in these two poly count wise. It's not a massive difference. It doesn't look like a horrible model now, but if we compare these, bring up your poly count heads up display, which anytime you're doing modeling, you really ought to have this. You can just go up to display, heads up display, and turn on poly count right there. And that will make this show up in the viewport, and it's really great for telling you how many vertices, edges, faces, etc. are in the current selection. So if I select this donut here, this is the high poly one, and we look at triangles, we can see that my current selection of triangles is 1,800 triangles. And that's quite a few. It's not crazy, but it's quite a few. But if I select the LOD1, we can see that we're down to 1,200-ish. So we just got rid of 600 polygons, right? And it almost looks the same, especially if we back the camera out to about here. Okay, and that's exactly what we want. So I don't like to go too crazy on this first LOD. We should have it be fairly well preserved, but still taking off somewhere between a third of the polygons and 50% of the polygons, somewhere in there. So next, we want to double check that our UVs still look good on this one. And if we just zoom in over here, we don't see any weird stray vertices that like went shooting off to the side or a shape that got broken or anything like that. So I think we're good to go. I mean, the true test really is to look at the model and see if the texture still holds up, and it looks like it does. Okay, I'm going to duplicate this one now, and I'm going to hide both of these because I don't need them anymore. Actually, let's put this one back in the center. Boop. And then hide LOD0, hide LOD1, and now we have LOD2. And we're starting from the first LOD that we made. It would be crazy to start back from the highest resolution one over and over again because you're kind of working against yourself. We already did some work, and we want to use that as our jumping off point. Now, the great thing with doing reductions on anything that is circular is that, by definition of trying to make something circular, you need lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of edges if you're going to be up close to it. But by nature of us backing the camera away, we can actually reduce those edges. And with perfectly circular things like this, it couldn't be easier to pick edges to be getting rid of. So on this one, I'm just going to go into edge mode. And I'm just going to start double clicking along all of these. I'm going to keep my, if we look along the grid here, I'm keeping this one perfectly vertical and this one perfectly horizontal edge. But other than that, I'm selecting every other edge on here. Okay, and if you modeled your model very well, you should be able to get away with pretty similar types of choices. Okay, I'm just going to do that for the bottom as well. Coming on along here, selecting every other one. Okay, that looks like it. And then I'm going to hit Control Delete. Boom. And look how little the model actually changed because of that. But we'll check out how many polygons we saved. So let me unhide LOD 1 and compare LOD 1 and LOD 2. So if we look at LOD 1, we have 1,200 triangles. And if we look at this one, we have 800. We just chopped off 400 triangles just by deleting every other edge loop on that circle. That's awesome. That is a great place to be. And if you've modeled your models carefully, you should be able to make similar choices with relative ease, making very clean LODs. Now we could take this even further. Two levels of detail is going to be just fine for what we're doing in this particular game, but you can go even further. And past this one is where I would really start to brutalize it. So if we duplicate this one again, we've got LOD 3 now, and bring this one over, we can really just start ripping into this thing. Selecting each of those, we'll do a collapse. Boom. Grab each of those, do a collapse. Down in here, we can we grab this? Can we collapse this? Boom. Right? And so you end up with an interesting choice here as well, is that as you start to delete things like that, notice I've lost my edge that attached it to the inner donut here. It's kind of floating, and there's this gap between the polygons where there used to be nice and closed up, where these non-contiguous pieces touched. And that's okay on this level of detail, because at this point you are going to see this model from so far away that you're never going to see that gap. So it's totally fine to have little issues like that creep up in the LOD, because you will never see it that close. Okay, and then I might even go one more time on this again of selecting every other one of these loops and seeing what we can get away with from deleting this. And it's going to look terrible now, right? That's pretty bad. Let's go one more here. Control Delete. Don't forget Control, otherwise you'll leave behind the vertices. Right? And there we go. We have a really brutalized version of that model. But if you look at it from back here, really, it doesn't look that bad, and that's exactly the whole point of these LODs. So, you do not have to pick ahead of time how many LODs you're going to do. The engine doesn't really care. It'll figure it out no matter what. You could have just one, you could have two. For this game, we definitely want at least two, so start with LOD 0, that's your maximum. LOD 1, which is still just a tiny bit of a step down. LOD 2 is going to be your far away one, and then you don't really need an LOD 3. Now, the last check you want to do on here is that you've probably, especially on this last one here, going to end up with n-gons as a result of this. So I'm going to select this model here, go up to Mesh, Cleanup, and under Mesh Cleanup, we can use this to either correct polygons or select them for us. So I'm going to go to Cleanup Matching Polygons, Apply to Selected Objects, and change this from fixed by tessellation. We're going to do, faces with more than 4 sides. Uncheck everything else. And uncheck all the stuff that's down here as well. We don't need any of those things checked. So we're just telling Mesh Cleanup to look for n-gons and turn them into triangles. And hit apply. And nothing happened to that one, which tells me there were no n-gons. I'm going to select this one and do it again. Apply. All right, and look at that. We went into face mode when we clicked apply, and it's highlighting all of the n-gons that it shattered into triangles. And I don't particularly care about fixing them and turning them back into quads at this point or anything like that, because it's just a level of detail. The whole point is for us to not really look at it that close up. And then lastly, let's grab this one here, and one more time, hit apply. Boom. Okay, so don't forget to check the UVs on these. So I'm going to select this one. Look over here. Again, we don't really see anything exploding out of the way that it shouldn't. Everything kind of lines up to where it was always supposed to be. That's looking pretty good. Okay, yeah, I think that's perfectly acceptable. Don't forget to delete history. So Alt-Shift-D. Okay, because all those edits we did are building up to history, and they're going to make it export strangely. I'm going to grab all of these, go to the channel box, and I'm going to clear out the transformation. Not freeze transformation, just clear it out to 0 so that they all stack perfectly there, back in the center of the grid. All right, and then the last step on exporting this with its LODs is it's very similar to exporting as before. Just select all of them in the outliner here, LOD0, LOD1, LOD2, LOD3, and then File, Export Selection. Don't do Export All, Export Selection. Okay, and from there, it's exactly the same as what you know already. What was this called? This LODs. Okay, that was a terrible name. Give it a real name. But when you export that, when you bring it into Unity, it will automatically figure out that those are LODs, hook up the component for you, and get them all set up and ready for you to go. Now, if you're replacing a model that you made previously with a new version here that has LODs, chances are you're going to have to remake the prefab, because renaming this to have the word LOD0 in it is going to make Unity not understand that it's the same model anymore. So you'll have to fix that. All right, there are more complicated models that you can take a look at as far as making LODs, but I'm not going to talk about those now unless anybody has specific questions. I do recommend bringing in your texture. You don't need all of the maps. You don't need the normals or anything like that. Just the albedo, so you can kind of see how things line up. Don't forget to delete the history. Don't forget to triangulate all of the n-gons, and keep everything centered, get those exported, and that will help us optimize the game.